Anyone here got any IKEA furniture? I'm not going to get you to come to the front and tell us about it. Oh, about 70% there. Yeah, I think that's great. We're going to watch an IKEA advert now. This is what it was like in 2013. The dogs on the bed. No one here has their pet dogs on their bed, do they? Who said yes? Oh, Andy Simmons. Is it a furry dog?
No,
She's fluffy. Okay, fantastic. That advert said it's 2013, the year of yes. A year of positivity, a year of what is the future going to bring. I would suggest that the last 2 years have been years of, to some degree, for most of us, years of no. Years of you cannot. Instead of years of haves, they've been years of haven'ts. Funerals we've had to watch online. Holidays we planned and rebooked and rebooked and rebooked. Weddings we postponed and postponed and eventually did. Family members we haven't seen for 2 years. Not years of yes in so many ways, rather years of no. Haven'ts instead of haves. Elijah, in our reading this morning, is in a period of haven'ts. 1 Kings 17, 1-6.
Now Elijah the Tishbite from Tishbe in Gilead said to Ahab, "As the Lord, the God of Israel lives, whom I serve, there will be neither dew nor rain in the next few years, except at my word." Then the word of the Lord came to Elijah, "Leave here, turn eastward, and hide in the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan. You will drink from the brook, and I have instructed the ravens to supply you with food there." So he did what the Lord had told him. He went to the Kerith ravine, east of the Jordan, and stayed there. The ravens brought him bread and meat in the morning, and bread and meat in the evening, and he drank from the brook.
Elijah's life is in the midst of kings and chaos, in the midst of God and idols, because King David has died and the kingdom of Israel has been split into two, Israel and Judah. And Elijah walks 15 miles from Jezreel to the River Jordan, and he enters a period of seclusion, a period of haven'ts, a period of no's. He's hiding in a foreign land because he's told King Ahab that there will be no rain in the country because he is worshipping the idol Baal. Baal is an idol that they believed was only around in the rainy seasons. In the dry seasons, no Baal, no power. So Elijah says, no rain, no idol for you to worship. He says, "The Lord, the God of Israel, lives, whom I serve," in verse 1. Elijah doesn't serve a theory. Elijah doesn't serve a slogan. Elijah doesn't serve a theology. Elijah doesn't serve a set of principles. Elijah doesn't serve a particular niche group within the Christian culture and say, "I'm with this tribe, but not those ones." Elijah serves the living God, the God that transcends those differences that so often invade the Christian community. He serves a living entity. And I don't know about you, but we could have forgotten in these 2 years of no that God is actually alive as we went through the humdrumness of life. And Elijah reminds us there is a living God. Eugene Peterson, one of my heroes, an American pastor, says, "Left to ourselves, we turn God into an object, something we can deal with, something we use to our benefit, whether that thing is a feeling or an idea or an image." Prophets scorn all such stuff. They train us to respond to God's presence and voice. And God is in that foreign land where Elijah is in seclusion. God doesn't have just one area where he can be active. God's not only active in our church building, he's active where you work, where you care for your children, for your elderly relatives, where we meet at the bus stop with some random person we've never known before, where we say at Aldi, after you, or maybe you go to Trozy, Waitrose, and you go, after you. God is in all those places, every single one of them. God's power isn't limited by geography. And he gives Elijah precise instructions in verses 2, 8, 14 and 16 and tells him what to do. And Elijah obeys God. In the midst of his haven'ts, in the midst of his no period, Elijah says, I'll do what you want, God. And God reminds him, I'm in control because I have ordered the ravens to feed you, in verse 4. And I have commanded a widow in that place to supply you with food, in verse 9. So wherever we live, wherever we shop, wherever we work, God is alive and active and calling us to obey him. It's a guy called Danny Simpson. And if he'd known more about guns, he wouldn't have got into trouble. But he felt he needed to rob a bank. And so in 1990 in Ottawa in Canada, he went as a 24-year-old and robbed a bank and ended up in jail. His gun didn't go to jail with him. His gun went to a museum because he was robbing the bank and got $6,000, but he used a .45 caliber Colt semi-automatic, which turned out to be an antique made in 1918. The gun that he robbed $6,000 with was worth over $100,000. If he'd only known what he had in his hand, then he wouldn't have used it for awful purposes. Do we know what's in our hands? Did Elijah? Did the widow? The reading continues in verse 7.
Sometime later, the brook dried up because there had been no rain in the land. Then the word of the Lord came to him, go at once to Zarephath in the region of Sidon and stay there. I have instructed a widow there to supply you with food. So he went to Zarephath. When he came to the town gate, a widow was there gathering sticks. He called to her and asked, would you bring me a little water in a jar so I may have a drink? As she was going to get it, he called, and bring me, please, a piece of bread. As surely as the Lord your God lives, she replied, I don't have any bread, only a handful of flour in a jar and a little olive oil in a jug. I am gathering a few sticks to take home and make a meal for myself and my son, that we may eat it and die. Elijah said to her, don't be afraid. Come home and do as you have said. But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. And then make something for yourself and your son. For this is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. She went away and did as Elijah had told her. So there was food every day for Elijah and for the woman and for her family. For the jar of flour was not used up, and the jug of oil did not run dry, in keeping with the word the Lord had spoken by Elijah.
I wonder if this widow's son was watching at a distance as she chatted with Elijah. I wonder if he could hear on the breeze and catch some of the words in the conversation between his mum and this wild holy man. I wonder if he thought, why are we using our last resources on a bloke we've never met? Surely, mum, this is a waste. But if he was like me, a respectful son, he would never have questioned his mother. God gave the widow precise instructions, just as God gave Elijah precise instructions. And Elijah obeyed them, but do you notice that the widow didn't? That the widow says, I've got no bread. Well, you've got the stuff to make it. My Joe makes bread most Sundays for us for lunchtime. And so you have those things and you can add them together and you can bake the bread. The widow could bake the bread, but she's decided to be stubborn-hearted with God and snub-nosed with Elijah and say, I've got no bread. Sometimes God speaks to us directly. Now, I know no one in here, but he speaks to us directly and we refuse to obey. And God gives us the freedom to do that. God doesn't make us do things like human flesh chess pieces on his divine board. God sometimes directs us and allows us to say, no, I'm not going to make the bread. But Elijah encourages her, and then she does. Do you notice that God even speaks to people that don't know him? This widow doesn't know God. She makes it really clear that it's Elijah's God, not hers. In verse 12, she says, as surely as the Lord your God lives. She's heard from a God she doesn't believe in. She's refused to follow and obey him. And yet still Elijah is there with her. And I don't blame her. This widow is strung out. She is afraid. She is dying. If you or I were going home with our child to prepare that last meal, would we not be in a similar place to where she was? I'm going home to prepare my last meal. Here is a woman who has lost all hope and is preparing to die. And woe betide us if we judge her because she's afraid, because she's given up hope. She's human after all. And in the midst of this mess, God feeds Elijah and the widow and her son with the flour and the oil that they have. I don't get the miracle. I don't understand it. I've got no scientific reasoning for it. But if I take the wonder and the miraculous out of who God is, then I've just got a theory. I've just got a formula that I call God. Because sometimes God does things beyond our expectation, which is one of our values as a church, expectancy. God doing things that we don't fully understand. If we ditch that, then we're just like a rowing club or a golf club, aren't we? John Knight fills me with wonder. He gives me gifts for church services. He said to me when we were having coffee on Thursday, Neil, I was the Milky Bar kid once. Can't you see the likeness there? I mean, look, the cuteness. I can barely tell without. If you put a hat on John, I wouldn't know which one was the Milky Bar kid. And he said to me, you can't use that in a sermon. I said, I'm using it this Sunday, John. He said, how will you use it? And I said, I use it like this, John. That you look so cute like that Milky Bar kid did. But the sad thing is, some kids never get to that stage where they can be cute. I've been in hospital rooms with babies that were dead and were delivered too early in a lovely wooden box, sat with a family as we wept because that baby didn't make it. I've had people speak to me about babies that didn't make it through the womb and that miscarriage that they kept quiet because they felt ashamed or they didn't know how to word the thing that had gone on in them and the experience that they had had. I've gone to Sweden to a friend where he held his 5-day-old son who weighed no more than a bag of sugar as the plugs were pulled out of him and 10 minutes later he breathed his last. And in a snow-filled country, we had a service for him, playing kiddies' tunes in the background that they thought he would have loved if he had grown up to be cute and lovely and have them. I've seen a pink coffin come down the aisle of a 16-year-old girl in Bexhill who died far too young, filled with pupils bawling their eyes out. Even these tough, broad lads. They would have loved to have been the Milky Bar kids. They would have loved that. And as I share my stories, you've thought of yours, personal, wider family, friends, where kids just didn't make it. They're eating their bread, they're eating their meat. The flour and the oil do not run out. And the Bible reading continues.
Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son?" "Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, Have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "Lord my God, let this boy's life return to him." The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth."
After all the good things, 3/4 of the way through this story, the boy dies. And often we edit the readings at points like that. There's one magnificent psalm that ends really angrily. I've never heard that last bit read out in a church service. But this is part of life. This is part of the story. Do you notice he died sometime later, when they'd got used to God's provision, when the good times were there and maybe they were taking them for granted, and all of a sudden lockdown comes. Haven'ts instead of haves, no's instead of yes, as the boy stops breathing. The widow has obviously lived a dodgy life because she says it's because of my sin that he's died. This was a common theology at the time, that if you did bad things, God would punish you. In John chapter 9, when Jesus is with his disciples, they're walking along and they see a man born blind, and the disciples say to Jesus, "Jesus, who sinned to make this man blind? Was it his parents or was it him? If you could just neaten up that little theological intricacy for us, we'd be really happy." And Jesus says, "No, you don't get it. That's not how it works." It's a theology that's wrong. When we sin, God doesn't punish us by killing our children, by making our children blind. It's wrong. I've heard people ask me that. "Neil, has this happened in my life because I did this?" Is that the kind of God we believe in? We believe in a God of justice, to be sure, of global justice, a God who convicts us of our sin and invites us to repent. But we believe in a God who woos us back, don't we? A God who loves us back to him. How would this serve God's purposes to kill this woman's son? Would that draw you back on your knees to God and say, "Oh, now I will worship you because you've done this"? There's a tension in this story, isn't there? A tension between God being in control and the chaos of nature. We have a God who commands the ravens and the widow to supply Elijah with food. And then we have the Kirith ravine that dries up and the widow's son who dies. There's a tension here that there is in our lives, isn't there? As you sit at home watching this, don't you feel that tension in your own life? As we sit in this room together, don't we feel sometimes there are times when I say, "God," like Habakkuk, "God, what are you really doing?" And there are other times where we say, "God, wow, look at what you're doing." And that tension is there through life. But faith is about continuing to believe in a God who is with us in the good times and the bad times. And in the midst of death, God answers Elijah's prayer. God offers life in the midst of death. God offers us yeses in the midst of no's. God offers us "I have" in the midst of "I haven'ts." Is God in control? The God who commands the ravens and the widow, and yet where the son dies? Do we have faith that when the boy dies, God will act as we've seen him do in the past? God raises the boy, and the widow believes. So how are we going to go into 2022? Are we going to go into 2022 with haven'ts or haves? Are we going to go into 22 saying, "God, you haven't"? Sometimes that's fine. A third of the Psalms are laments where they say, God, where are you? Lamentations is lament, for crying out loud. There are appropriate times where we can say, God, I'm not happy with things. I don't understand what's going on. But we can't live our whole lives like that, can we? Like the widow who says, I don't have any bread. Elijah who says, go home and do as you have said. The widow who says, what do you have against me, man of God? Elijah who says, Lord my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I am staying with by causing her son to die? There are loads of haven'ts in the world. It hasn't happened as I would wish. But in the midst of that tension, God says, I have. You will drink from the brook, and I have instructed the ravens to supply you with food there. I have instructed a widow there to supply you with food. So which words will we live by this year? God, you haven't? Or will we hear a God who says, I have? Elijah chooses, I have. Would you bring me a little jar of water so I may have a drink? But first make a small loaf of bread for me from what you have and bring it to me. In the fragility and chaos of life, Elijah chooses, I have. Will I choose haves instead of haven'ts more in 2022? Will I offer life in the midst of death?
So what will you choose this year? Elijah chose life. And just as one of the things I have on my desk at home is a piece of wood from probably 10 years ago. I had one of those epiphany moments in a certain place. And I took the piece of wood from that place, and it sits on my desk for 10 years as a reminder of that moment. And just at the beginning of this year, it might be that we just take a piece of wood from our garden or local park and just mark something on it of I have. I have, in the midst of everything that feels as if it's claustrophobic and working against us maybe. Just that, again, that sense at the beginning of this year, I have. So if that's helpful to you, maybe just pick up, inspired by that video, a piece of wood, and to have that in a kind of prominent place through this year.